They say a parent always knows their child's voice, but what happens when you hear it whispering through the static of a midnight broadcast 3 years after her case went cold? Inside that garbled, fading signal was a sound that no prankster could ever fake. 3 sharp, terrified taps against the phone receiver. The secret panic code Ava only ever used when she was in deep trouble. Now, to understand how a single late-night transmission dragged a broken man into the darkest corners of Chicago, we have to look back at the quiet prison he built for himself. It all started on an ordinary, freezing winter evening when Ethan was still just a ghost speaking to other ghosts in the dark. Every night, Ethan sat behind the heavy studio glass, his tired eyes watching the audio levels bounce as he talked desperate strangers down from the edge of their own ruins. He was the city's midnight savior, dispensing warm, calming wisdom to everyone who called in. But the second the red on-air light died, his own face would collapse into a hollow mask of grief. His hand would slide across the cold desk, fingers tracing the worn edges of a framed photo of Ava, his lost daughter. He couldn't shake the memory of the night she vanished, recalling how she tried to tell him about a dangerous mystery she was investigating, and how he had dismissed her warnings as mere youthful obsession. Clutching his keys, he would walk out into the freezing Chicago wind, completely numb to the world around him. He would drive through the quiet streets, a man who survived because he was too tired to stop breathing. The next morning, Ethan stood in the sterile light of the police precinct, desperately trying to make the detectives listen to his tape of the midnight transmission. But the lead investigator only sighed, pushing the file back and telling him it was just a cruel, sick prank meant to exploit his pain. Ethan's voice cracked with rage as he pleaded with them, pointing to the rhythmic triple tap on the recording. But the detective's cold, dismissive look made it clear that to the city, Ava was already a forgotten statistic. Slamming his fists on the desk, Ethan realized the system had completely given up on his daughter. He grabbed the recorder, walked out of the building, and looked up at the vast, uncaring skyline. If the law wouldn't hunt for his daughter, he would build his own radar and do it himself. Back in his dark studio, Ethan began dismantling old radio gear, his hands moving with a frantic, desperate energy. He set up advanced oscilloscopes and signal-boosting software, feeding the raw call audio into his terminal. Hour after hour, he stripped away layers of wind noise and city hum, focusing entirely on the hidden digital signature of the call. The audio waveform slowly began to reveal a strange, high-frequency carrier wave embedded underneath the voice. It wasn't a standard cellular signal. It was a relic, an analog frequency bouncing off retired metropolitan relays. He highlighted the frequency spikes, overlaying them onto a digital map of Chicago's old communication infrastructure. A single, faint coordinate pin began to pulse on the edge of his screen, pointing directly to an industrial sector. He packed a heavy flashlight, a handheld radio scanner, and a multi-tool into his leather bag. Staring at his reflection in the dark window, the passive grief in his eyes was replaced by a sharp, dangerous focus. He locked the studio doors behind him, stepping into the shadow of his crusade. He drove off into the night, the signal scanner whistling quietly on his dashboard. The coordinates led him to a forgotten underground railway junction beneath a sprawling concrete bridge. He descended the rusted maintenance stairs, his flashlight beam cutting through the damp, heavy darkness. As he walked deeper, his scanner began to ping rapidly, indicating a localized, active broadcast source nearby. He followed the sound to a heavy steel door, which swung open to reveal a makeshift glowing server rack humming in the dark. On top of the rack sat a small portable cassette player wired directly into the transmission antenna. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest as he approached, his trembling hand reaching out to press the play button. A voice crackled through the speakers, but it wasn't Ava's. It was a pre-recorded synthesized loop mocking him for coming so far.
Suddenly, the steel door slammed shut behind him with a deafening metallic clang. The server rack hissed, releasing a thick, choking cloud of chemical gas into the small room. Ethan coughed violently, throwing his body against the locked door as his vision began to blur into terrifying darkness.
Gasping for air, Ethan used his flashlight to smash the glass face of an old emergency box, grabbing a heavy iron wrench from inside. He swung the wrench with all his remaining strength, denting the locked door's latch mechanism again and again. With one final desperate strike, the latch sheared off, and he burst through the door, collapsing onto the cold concrete of the tunnel. He crawled away from the leaking gas, his lungs burning as he pulled himself up onto a pair of abandoned train tracks. Suddenly, the beam of a high-powered spotlight blinded him from the far end of the dark tunnel. Heavy, tactical footsteps echoed toward him, accompanied by the cold sound of a firearm chambering around. Ethan scrambled to his feet, running blindly into the pitch-black labyrinth of the Chicago subway system. Bullets sparked against the brick walls beside his head, showering him in stone dust. He threw himself down an active maintenance chute, sliding into the filthy, roaring waters of the city sewers below. He tumbled through the rushing water, bruised and battered, before finally washing up onto a concrete bank. Exhausted and shivering, he lay in the dark, listening to his shattered scanner hiss in his pocket. He realized then that whoever was keeping Ava didn't just want her hidden, they were actively guarding the frequency. He limped out of the sewer exit into the freezing rain, his body broken, but his mind completely on fire.
Needing answers he couldn't find alone, Ethan dragged himself to a dusty, hidden radio archive owned by Marcus, a retired systems engineer. Marcus patched up Ethan's cuts in the warm light of the workshop, listening to the impossible story of the midnight call. Marcus shook his head in disbelief, warning Ethan that chasing this signal would only lead to a shallow grave. But Ethan grabbed Marcus's hand, pleading with his oldest friend not to let Ava die a second time. Reluctantly, Marcus pulled up a heavily encrypted schematics database of Chicago's old civil defense networks. He pointed to a series of hidden subterranean relay nodes that were never officially decommissioned by the city. Marcus revealed that someone had quietly hijacked these dead zones, turning them into a private, untraceable darknet. As they dug deeper into the historic access logs, Marcus's face went pale. He pointed to a student login ID used to access these exact servers 3 years ago. It was Ava's university account. Ethan stared at the screen, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. Ava hadn't been targeted by chance. She had actively breached their wall. Determined to find what she left behind, Ethan and Marcus tracked Ava's last digital footprint to an old cloud locker she had set up under a pseudonym. With Marcus's help, they cracked the encryption, opening a massive directory of audio files, photos, and scanned documents. Ethan opened a video file, and Ava's face suddenly filled the screen, looking tired but fiercely determined. She spoke directly to the camera, explaining that she had uncovered a highly organized network operating out of abandoned city infrastructure. This network wasn't just hiding people. They were running a massive off-the-grid human trafficking and black market containment system. She explained that they used old emergency broadcast frequencies to coordinate their movements and track their prisoners. Ava's voice began to tremble as she revealed she was about to go undercover at their primary transmission hub to expose them. The video abruptly ended with the sound of a door being kicked open and distant, muffled shouting. Ethan stared at the frozen frame of his daughter, tears finally spilling down his bruised face. He understood now that her silence was her sacrifice, a sacrifice he had failed to see. The guilt that had haunted him for 3 years suddenly crystallized into pure, lethal resolve. He was no longer just a father looking for his daughter. He was the executioner of the network that took her. He looked at Marcus, his voice dead and calm, demanding they find the location of that primary hub. Before Marcus could trace the hub's location, the workshop's power grid suddenly died, plunging them into absolute darkness. Red laser sights sliced through the dusty windows, dancing across the walls. Ethan tackled Marcus to the floor, just as a hail of automatic gunfire shattered the glass, shredding the archives. Heavy armored mercenaries kicked the doors off their hinges, firing blindly into the smoke. Ethan grabbed a flare from Marcus's workbench, striking it and throwing it directly into an open fuel canister near the entrance. A massive explosion ripped through the front of the shop, sending a wall of fire rolling toward the attackers. Through the smoke and heat, Ethan tried to drag Marcus toward the back exit, but Marcus collapsed, gasping for air. Ethan looked down and saw a dark stain spreading across Marcus's chest. He had been hit in the crossfire. Marcus grabbed Ethan's collar, shoving an encrypted flash drive containing the final hub coordinates into his hand. With his last breath, Marcus told him to run and finish what Ava started. Ethan watched his friend's eyes go blank as the flames began to consume the workshop. With the mercenaries closing in, Ethan was forced to abandon the burning building, escaping into the freezing rain alone. Standing in the shadow of a decaying warehouse alley, Ethan watched the smoke from the fire rise into the stormy night sky. He had lost his studio, his records, and now his only ally lay dead in the ashes of his workshop. He sat on the wet concrete, holding the bloody flash drive, feeling completely defeated and empty. The silence of the city pressed down on him, a heavy weight that threatened to crush his spirit. He remembered all the times he had turned off his microphone, choosing comfort over conflict, silence over truth. He realized that his silence had allowed this darkness to grow, costing him his daughter and his friend. He looked at his reflection in a dark puddle, seeing a broken man who had nothing left to lose. He stood up slowly, wiping the rain and blood from his face, his expression hardening into cold determination. If they wanted silence, he was going to give them the loudest broadcast this city had ever heard. Ethan mobilized his plan, driving a stolen news van equipped with a high-powered microwave transmitter directly to the city's main emergency tower. He broke into the base station, quickly hardwiring his custom flash drive into the city's primary broadcast array. With a single keystroke, he hijacked every radio station, television channel, and digital billboard in Chicago, flooding them with Ava's recorded evidence. As her voice began to echo across the city, Ethan grabbed his gear and headed straight for the primary hub coordinates, a massive decommissioned water treatment plant. He breached the perimeter wall under the cover of the raging storm, navigating the dark industrial corridors with a heavy iron pipe in hand. Sirens blared inside the facility as the network realized their entire operation was being exposed to the world. Ethan blindsided a guard in the corridor, stripping him of his tactical gear and weapon before moving deeper. He descended into the central holding area, finding a subterranean labyrinth of secure steel cells. The facility director, realizing the game was over, stood in the center of the control room trying to delete their databases. Ethan kicked the door open, firing a warning shot that shattered the monitors around the director. The director lunged at him with a knife, but Ethan blocked the strike, slamming him against the concrete pillar. With a final, crushing blow, Ethan knocked the director cold, throwing him to the ground. He turned to the main holding cell, blowing the lock off the heavy steel door with his rifle. The door swung open to reveal a group of terrified prisoners, and right in the center, her eyes wide with shock and hope, stood Ava. Ava stared at Ethan as if her mind refused to accept reality, unable to believe the man standing before her had actually crossed hell to reach her. Ava ran toward him without hesitation, throwing herself into his arms as Ethan held her tighter than he had held anything in years. Around them, the other prisoners stood frozen, watching a reunion they thought only happened in dreams. Tears rolled down Ava's face as she whispered that she thought nobody would ever find her. Ethan held her shoulders and promised her he wasn't leaving her behind again. Suddenly, the alarm's facility shifted tone, and red emergency lights began flashing across the holding labyrinth. Ethan looked toward the corridor as distant automatic gunfire echoed through the underground structure. The released prisoners began panicking as the sound of boots and shouting moved closer through the tunnels. Holding Ava close beside him, Ethan led the frightened prisoners through the industrial corridors. Behind them, emergency systems started shutting down one by one as the entire hidden network collapsed into chaos. Water pipes burst overhead, spraying cold streams across the corridors, while sparks rained from damaged electrical panels. Ava looked at Ethan and quietly admitted that she never stopped believing he would come. Ethan looked forward in silence because there was no answer powerful enough for the years they had lost.